May 5, 1945, late afternoon, near the village of Itter, North Tyrol, Austria. Lieutenant John Pimlott of the 142nd Infantry Regiment, 36th Infantry Division, felt the rumble of his Sherman tank through the soles of his boots. The air, crisp with the scent of alpine pine, was fouled by the acrid sting of cordite. Up ahead, perched on a wooded bluff overlooking the valley, was his objective, Schloss Itter, a medieval castle that had no business being a battleground in the 20th century. For hours, his relief column had fought its way up the narrow mountain roads, swatting aside pockets of determined SS resistance. The radio chatter from the castle had been sporadic, desperate. An American captain, a man named Lee, was trapped inside with a handful of his men, besieged by a company of the Waffen-SS. Standard stuff for the chaotic final week of the war in Europe. But as Pimlott's task force finally broke into the clearing below the castle, the scene that greeted him defied all logic, all training, all understanding of the war he had been fighting. "This can't be right," he thought, raising his field glasses. "My eyes have to be playing tricks on me. That's an American helmet, and that's a Stahlhelm, side by side." He focused the lenses, dialing in on the main gatehouse. The stonework was pockmarked with fresh impacts from small arms and what looked like a high-caliber anti-tank gun. A knocked-out American M4 Sherman, its hull blackened and smoking, sat askew near the bridge, a silent monument to a failed defense. SS dead lay scattered across the manicured lawns. But it was the figures on the battlements that held his gaze. There, crouched behind a centuries-old parapet, was a GI in the olive drab of the U.S. Army, feeding an ammunition belt into an MG-42, the infamous German machine gun nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw. And operating the weapon was a man in the Feldgrau uniform of the German Wehrmacht. He swept his glasses along the wall. He saw it again and again. American soldiers and German soldiers, fighting from the same positions, aiming at the same enemy in the woods beyond. At the center of the gatehouse parapet, an American officer, Captain Lee, it had to be, was pointing, shouting orders. Next to him, a German officer returned a brisk nod before relaying the commands to his own men. The discovery was so fundamentally jarring, it felt like a hallucination. 3 days before the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich, American GIs were fighting and dying to defend a castle. But their brothers in arms, the men whose lives they depended on, were not more Americans. They were soldiers of the German Wehrmacht, the very enemy the 142nd Infantry Regiment had been fighting across France and Germany for the better part of a year. Sworn enemies had become allies. The black-uniformed men of the SS, theoretically on the same side as the Wehrmacht soldiers, were the common foe. The neat, brutal lines of the Second World War had for one incomprehensible afternoon been completely redrawn. Pimlott lowered his glasses, the question burning in his mind. How in God's name did this happen? The journey to this surreal moment had begun years earlier, not with a military decision but with a bureaucratic one. The medieval structure of Schloss Itter, with its thick stone walls and isolated location in the Austrian Alps, was deemed the perfect high-security prison by the architects of the Third Reich. In early 1943, under the direct authority of Heinrich Himmler, the castle was officially designated a Sonderlager, a special camp, and placed under the administration of the Dachau concentration camp system. Its purpose was unique, to house high-value prisoners of state, the so-called Ehrenhäftlinge, or honor prisoners of France. These were not common political dissidents, they were the very men who had led the French Third Republic into war against Germany. The guest list was a who's who of pre-war French power. There was Édouard Daladier, the former prime minister who had signed the Munich Agreement in 1938. Alongside him was his political rival, Paul Reynaud, the man who served as prime minister during the catastrophic Battle of France in 1940. There was General Maurice Gamelin, the commander-in-chief of the French armed forces in 1940, and his successor, General Maxime Weygand. Adding to the mix were figures like Léon Jouat, a prominent trade union leader and Nobel Peace Prize winner, and Jean Waratras, a tennis superstar and former Vichy government official who had since turned against the regime. Even Marie-Agnès de Gaulle, the sister of the leader of the Free French, was held there. These individuals were more than prisoners. They were political pawns, held by Himmler as potential bargaining chips in a war that was already beginning to turn against Germany. For 2 years, life in the Castle prison was a strange mix of gilded cage and psychological torment. The prisoners were afforded certain privileges denied to ordinary camp inmates. They were allowed to keep their personal belongings, wear their own clothes, and were served meals by a staff of Eastern European prisoners from Dachau. Yet they were constantly watched. The commandant, a succession of SS officers, maintained a rigid and unpredictable discipline. The final commandant, Sebastian Wimmer, was a particularly cruel and unstable man, a functionary who seemed to relish his power over men who had once commanded nations. He made it clear that their status as honor prisoners was a temporary designation that could be revoked at any moment. As the Allied armies closed in on Germany from east and west in the spring of 1945, the atmosphere inside Castle Itter grew thick with dread. The prisoners listened to the changing tones of the BBC on a hidden radio, their hopes rising with each Allied victory, but so too did their fear. They knew that in the death throes of the Third Reich, fanatics were in control. Himmler's orders were clear. No prominent prisoner was to fall into Allied hands alive. They were to be executed. On May 2, 1945, with American forces just miles away, Commandant Wimmer panicked. He executed the former camp commander Eduard Weiter for perceived defeatism and then abandoned his post, fleeing the castle with his senior staff. For a brief moment, the prisoners were left under the guard of a handful of remaining SS Totenkopf-Verwandte, the Death's Head units. Seeing their chance, the prisoners, led by the Frenchmen, organized. They armed themselves with abandoned weapons, and with the help of the camp's cook, a brave Yugoslav communist named Zvonimir Chuchkovic, they took control of the castle. Chuchkovic was dispatched on a bicycle with a letter written by the prisoners pleading for Allied help from the nearest town. They were now masters of their own prison, but they were isolated, lightly armed, and they knew it was only a matter of time before a more determined SS unit arrived to carry out their death sentences. The fairy tale castle had become a trap, and the clock was ticking. While the French dignitaries nervously paced the castle battlements, the world outside was disintegrating. The pattern of collapse across what was left of the Third Reich was not one of orderly surrender, but of violent, chaotic fragmentation. In the Tyrol region of Austria, this process was especially acute. The so-called Alpine Fortress, Hitler's mythical last stand, was proving to be just that, a myth. But the mountains were still infested with thousands of German troops, a bewildering mix of units with fractured loyalties and contradictory orders. The chain of command, once the bedrock of the German military, had shattered. One faction was the Wehrmacht, the regular German army. By May 1945, many of its officers and enlisted men were veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened soldiers who knew the war was lost. They were professionals, deeply cynical of the Nazi Party's political fanaticism, and now primarily concerned with surviving the final days of the conflict and securing an orderly surrender to the Western Allies to avoid falling into Soviet hands. They saw continued fighting as a pointless waste of life. Many, especially those of Austrian birth, were quietly connecting with local resistance cells, preparing to lay down their arms and assist in the transition of power. A second and far more dangerous faction was the Waffen-SS. These were the true believers, men indoctrinated from youth in the brutal ideology of National Socialism. Units like the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division Gutz von Berlingen, which was retreating through the area, were filled with young, battle-hardened fanatics who had committed atrocities across Europe. They considered any Wehrmacht soldier who spoke of surrender a traitor. In the final days of the Reich, SS commanders took it upon themselves to enforce Hitler's scorched earth Nero decrees, executing deserters, defeatists, and local officials who attempted to surrender their towns. They were a rogue force, operating outside any logical military structure, driven by a nihilistic death cult. They were determined to drag Germany down with them. This created a state of undeclared civil war within the German armed forces. In towns across the Tyrol, Wehrmacht garrisons found themselves in tense standoffs with roving SS execution squads. A German soldier's greatest threat was no longer the American GI in front of him, but the SS man behind him. It was a pattern of internal terror. In the nearby town of Wergl, this conflict came to a head. The Wehrmacht commander there was a man named Josef Sepp Gangl. A highly decorated career officer and a veteran of Stalingrad, Gangl had long since lost his faith in the Nazi cause. He had established contact with the local Austrian resistance, led by Alois Mehr, and was actively disobeying direct orders from his superiors to fight to the last man. He was instead preparing to surrender his troops to the approaching Americans. But he knew that elements of the 17th SS were prowling the countryside looking for just this kind of treason. He was walking a tightrope trying to save his men and the local population from a final meaningless bloodbath. It was into this powder keg of paranoia, betrayal, and shifting loyalties that Zvonimir Chuchkovich, the Yugoslav handyman from Castle Itter, rode his bicycle on the morning of May 4th, carrying a desperate plea for help. The tactical picture in the Inn River Valley shifted irrevocably on the morning of May 4th, 1945. Zvonimir Chuchkovich, exhausted after a perilous nighttime journey, pedaled into the town of Wergl and made contact with the local resistance. They immediately brought him to the man they trusted, the Wehrmacht officer who held de facto control of the town, Major Josef Sepp Gangl. In a makeshift command post, Gangl listened intently as the Yugoslav explained the situation. High-ranking French prisoners had seized their castle prison but were now stranded, armed with only a handful of rifles. Fanatical Waffen-SS troops were massing nearby, undoubtedly with orders to liquidate them. It was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. For Major Gangl, this was the moment of ultimate decision. He was a German officer, sworn to an oath, but the state he had sworn to serve was now a murderous rump regime represented by the very SS fanatics he despised. To help the prisoners would be an act of high treason, punishable by immediate execution. To do nothing would be to condemn a group of defenseless men to slaughter. Gangl, a professional soldier who still adhered to a code of military honor, did not hesitate. He pledged to help, but he knew his small detachment of Wehrmacht soldiers, mostly men from a signals unit with little combat experience, would be no match for a determined SS assault. He had perhaps 20 loyal men and a single truck. He needed more firepower. He needed armor. He needed the Americans. Knowing the risks, Gangl made a fateful choice. He would go to the Americans himself, under a white flag, and beg for their help. It was a desperate gamble. He could be shot on sight by a trigger-happy GI or arrested and sent to a POW camp, his plea ignored. But it was the only chance the prisoners had. Taking a staff car and flying a large white sheet from the antenna, Major Gangl drove north towards the American lines near the town of Kufstein. He didn't have to go far. On a country road, he encountered a reconnaissance patrol from the 12th Armored Division. The lead vehicle was an M4 Sherman tank. Perched in the turret was Captain John C. Jack Lee, Jr., commander of Company B, 23rd Tank Battalion. Lee was a hard-nosed, combat-seasoned officer, just 27 years old. He listened with deep suspicion as the German major, speaking through an interpreter, laid out the fantastic story: French VIPs, a captured castle, and an impending SS massacre. Lee's orders were simple: hold his position and await the arrival of the 36th Infantry Division. He was explicitly forbidden from venturing further into enemy territory on unverified intelligence. Rescuing French politicians with the help of the German army was not in his mission brief. The two officers, representatives of armies that had been trying to kill each other for years, sized each other up. Lee saw in Gangl not a Nazi ideologue, but a professional soldier, a man bound by a sense of duty that transcended politics. He saw the desperation in the German's eyes. In his memoir, The Last Battle, author Stephen Harding recounts Lee's thought process. It was a career-defining and potentially career-ending decision. Against all regulations, against his direct orders, Captain Lee agreed to help. He would take a small force to the castle. Assembling the rescue mission was a study of improvisation. He could only spare a handful of men and 2 tanks. One tank, however, immediately developed engine trouble and was left behind. That left him with a single M4 Sherman, callsign Besotten Jenny, commanded by Sergeant William Elliott. With Lee were 14 American soldiers. Major Gangl brought with him 10 of his own Wehrmacht artillerymen who had volunteered for the mission, plus his young driver. This was the entirety of the force: 15 Americans, 11 Germans, and 1 tank, setting off to defend a medieval castle against what they were told could be over 150 hardened Waffen-SS troops. As they rumbled towards Itter, the surreal nature of their alliance settled in. American GIs shared cigarettes with German Lanzer. Captain Lee, a tanker from New York, conferred on tactics with Major Gangl, an artilleryman from Bavaria. They were no longer Americans and Germans. They were simply soldiers, united by a common mission and a common enemy. The impossible choice had been made, and the stage for one of history's strangest battles was now set. The strange alliance forged on the road to Castle Itter was not the result of a grand strategy or a political calculation. It was the product of a series of intensely personal decisions made by men whose core beliefs were being tested in the crucible of a collapsing world. The design philosophy of this impromptu fighting force was not found in any field manual. It was rooted in the character of its 2 commanders, Captain Jack Lee and Major Sepp Gangl. The mathematics of their choice were brutally simple. On one side was a code of professional military conduct and basic human decency. On the other, the nihilistic fanaticism of the Waffen-SS. Captain Jack Lee was the epitome of the American citizen soldier. Before the war, he was a student at the University of Notre Dame. He was not an ideologue, he was a pragmatist, a problem solver tasked with a job: defeat the German army and go home. His decision to defy orders was not taken lightly. It violated the core tenets of military discipline. But Lee operated on a higher principle, one common among many American officers of his generation: the imperative to act. He was presented with a clear and present danger to human life. He had the means, however limited, to intervene. To stand by and do nothing while men were slaughtered simply because of a line on a map or a paragraph in a field order struck him as a profound moral failure. His philosophy was not about following the letter of the law, but the spirit of his duty as an officer and a human being. He saw a problem that needed solving, and he acted. The fact that his new allies wore the enemy's uniform was a secondary, almost irrelevant detail in the face of the immediate ethical crisis. Major Josef Sepp Gangl represented a different but complementary philosophy. He was a product of the German military tradition, a career officer who had served with distinction and earned the German Cross in Gold on the Eastern Front. He was not a member of the Nazi Party. Like many in the professional Wehrmacht officer corps, he harbored a deep disdain for the SS, viewing them as thuggish political enforcers masquerading as soldiers. He had sworn an oath to Adolf Hitler, But by May 1945, it was clear that Hitler's regime had betrayed every principle of honor and decency that Gangl held dear. His actions were not just about saving the French prisoners, they were an act of rebellion against the moral corruption of the Nazi state. He was reclaiming the honor of the German soldier from the fanatics who had hijacked it. His decision was a deliberate rejection of the Führerprinzip, the principle of blind obedience, and a return to an older, more profound code of conduct, the duty of a soldier to protect the innocent. By joining forces with the Americans, Gangl was not betraying Germany. In his mind, he was fighting for the real Germany, the one that had been buried under 12 years of Nazi brutality. This shared philosophy extended to the enlisted men. Lee's GIs were combat veterans who trusted his judgment implicitly. They were weary of war but understood the stakes. Gangl's men were mostly older Austrians, conscripted into a war they didn't believe in and were eager to see it end. They felt a greater loyalty to their Austrian homeland and to their decent commander than to a distant, insane Führer in a Berlin bunker. And within the castle walls themselves, the French prisoners, men of vastly different political stripes, conservatives, socialists, military men, were now united. Paul Renault, the defiant prime minister, worked alongside his old rival Édouard Daladier. The professional soldier Maxim Weygand offered tactical advice. Even the flamboyant tennis star John Borotraw proved to be a nimble and courageous scout. The design of the defense of Castle Itter was therefore a microcosm of a post-war ideal, a coalition based not on nationality or political ideology, but on a shared opposition to fanaticism and a common belief in the fundamental value of human life. It was an alliance that should have been impossible, but for the men involved, it was the only choice that made any sense. The consequences of this impossible choice arrived at dawn on May 5, 1945. The ad hoc defense force had spent the night fortifying the ancient castle. Captain Lee positioned the Sherman tank Besotten Jenny to command the main approach, guarding the narrow bridge over a ravine. He then methodically established fields of fire for his small contingent of riflemen and machine gunners, placing his Americans and Gangl's Germans in mixed positions along the castle walls and in the formidable gatehouse, the Torhaus. Inside, the French VIPs, though unarmed, contributed by preparing makeshift medical supplies and boiling water to throw on any attackers who might reach the walls. Major Gangl, with his intimate knowledge of German tactics and weaponry, proved invaluable, helping Lee anticipate the enemy's moves. The attack began not with a grand assault, but with a series of probing attacks. A force of approximately 150 to 200 men from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division under the command of an SS Hauptsturmführer had surrounded the castle. They were equipped with machine guns, mortars, and Panzerfausts. Their initial probes were designed to test the defenses, and they were met with disciplined, accurate fire from the castle walls. The crack of American M1 Garands mingled with the distinctive high-cycle rip of a German MG-42, a sound that must have been utterly bewildering to the SS attackers. For hours, a bitter firefight raged. The defenders were heavily outnumbered and perilously low on ammunition, but the castle's thick stone walls provided excellent cover. The tactical linchpin of the defense was Besotten Jenny. The Sherman's 75mm main gun and .50 caliber machine gun repeatedly broke up SS attempts to mass for a concerted assault on the main gate. The SS, recognizing the threat, prioritized its destruction. Shortly after noon, they maneuvered an 88mm anti-tank gun into a concealed position in the woods. The German 88 was perhaps the most feared artillery piece of the war, deadly accurate against both aircraft and tanks. The first shell struck the Sherman, rocking it on its suspension. The second, a direct hit, penetrated the armor and set the tank ablaze. The crew bailed out, scrambling for the safety of the castle gate under a hail of machine gun fire. But their most powerful weapon was now a burning wreck. The loss of the tank was a devastating blow to the defenders' morale and firepower. With the Sherman gone, the SS commander grew bolder. He ordered his 88mm gun to begin systematically blasting the main gatehouse. Huge chunks of medieval stone were blown away with each impact. Under this covering fire, SS shock troops advanced on the main gate, planting explosive charges to breach it. The fighting became desperate, almost hand-to-hand. Captain Lee was everywhere, redeploying his men, directing fire, and firing his own submachine gun from the ramparts. It was during this intense period of the battle that the Alliance paid its highest price. Major Gangl was on the main parapet with Captain Lee, trying to get a better view of the SS movements to direct the defense. As he peered over the edge, the sharp crack of a sniper's rifle echoed from the trees. Gangl crumpled to the ground, shot through the head. He was killed instantly. The Wehrmacht officer who had risked everything to save the prisoners had become the battle's only military fatality. His death, while a tragic loss, did not break the defenders' resolve. It hardened it. They knew surrender was not an option. The SS would show no mercy. As the afternoon wore on, their ammunition dwindled to just a few rounds per man. The massive oak gates were beginning to splinter under the continuous shelling of the 88. The end seemed inevitable. Inside the castle, the defenders braced for the final SS charge, a last stand in the rubble of the gatehouse. It was at this moment, with hope all but lost, that they heard a new sound from the valley below, the rumble of tank engines and the unmistakable chatter of American .50 caliber machine guns. The relief force had finally arrived. When the lead elements of Lieutenant Pimlott's task force from the 142nd Infantry Regiment stormed the area, the SS attackers, caught between the castle defenders and the fresh American armor, broke and fled into the surrounding forests. The siege of Castle Itter was over. The final accounting of the battle revealed the brutal efficiency of the defense and the stark contrast between the forces involved. The defenders. Personnel, approximately 26 combatants, 15 U.S. Army soldiers commanded by Captain Jack Lee, 11 German Wehrmacht soldiers commanded by Major Josef Gangl. They were assisted by the French prisoners and anti-Nazi Austrian resistance members within the castle. Equipment: one M4A3E8 Sherman tank, Besotten Jenny, destroyed in action. A mix of personal weapons, M1 Garand rifles, M1 carbines, Thompson submachine guns, Browning automatic rifles, and German Kar 98K rifles, and one MG42 machine gun. Casualties: one killed in action, Wehrmacht Major Josef Gangl. Several wounded, including 4 of Captain Lee's GIs. The attackers. Personnel: an estimated 150 to 200 soldiers from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, Gotz von Berlichingen. Equipment: standard German infantry weapons, Kar 98K rifles, MG42 machine guns, STG-44 assault rifles, and MP40 submachine guns. Support weapons: mortars, Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets, and at least one 88mm flak gun. Casualties. Accurate SS casualty figures are difficult to confirm due to the chaotic nature of their retreat. However, estimates based on bodies left at the scene and post-battle reports suggest several dozen were killed or wounded. Over 100 SS soldiers were captured by the relieving American force in the aftermath. The philosophical difference between the combatants was laid bare in the results. The defenders were a composite force united by a professional defensive ethos. Their goal was clear and limited: protect the lives of the prisoners and hold the castle until relief arrived. They used the castle's formidable structure to their advantage, conserved ammunition, and fought with disciplined coordination. Their success was a testament to the leadership of Lee and Gangl, who seamlessly integrated their men into a single cohesive unit. The SS, in contrast, fought with ideological fury but questionable tactical acumen. Their mission was not military but political, and execution. They relied on brute force and superior numbers, launching costly frontal attacks against a well-defended hardpoint. Their failure to quickly neutralize the castle's defenses and their vulnerability to the eventual American relief column demonstrated the limitations of fanaticism when pitted against professional soldiering and fortified positions. In the aftermath, Captain Jack Lee was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his extraordinary heroism and leadership. Major Josef Gangl was posthumously honored as a national hero in Austria, with a street in Vorgl named after him. He is remembered as a German officer who died defending the innocent from the criminality of the Nazi regime he had once served. The French dignitaries, including Daladier and Renault, were safely evacuated, their lives saved by the most improbable alliance of the entire war. The final tally was not just of military statistics, but of moral choices. One German major's decision to uphold his honor over his orders saved over a dozen lives and wrote one of World War II's most incredible and inspiring final chapters. The sight that greeted Lieutenant Pimlott and the men of the 142nd Infantry was the final surreal proof of the day's events. On the battlements of a medieval Austrian castle, the American flag now flew. But standing beneath it, amid the smoke and rubble, were American GIs tending to their wounded comrades, while German Wehrmacht soldiers, now technically prisoners of war, helped clear debris and collect weapons. The battle was over. But the image of these two uniformed groups working together, their enmity erased by a shared, brutal experience, would be seared into the memory of all who saw it. The battle for Castle Itter was more than a mere historical footnote. It was a powerful symbol of a profound truth laid bare in the war's final, chaotic moments. For one day, on one small patch of ground, the complex moral landscape of the war was distilled into a simple, undeniable equation. It was not a battle of Americans versus Germans. It was a battle of soldiers versus murderers, of professionals versus fanatics, of men who sought to preserve life versus a regime determined to extinguish it. The uniforms ceased to matter. What mattered was the choice each man made when faced with a clear moral line. Major Gangl and his men chose honor. Captain Lee and his GIs chose to risk everything for strangers. Together, they formed an alliance not of nations, but of principles. The final irony is inescapable. The battle took place on May 5, 1945. Just 2 days later, the formal instrument of surrender was signed at Reims. The war in Europe was effectively over. This last, strange fight was a punctuation mark at the end of a 6-year sentence of bloodshed, a final, violent spasm that demonstrated both the worst and the best of humanity. It revealed the nihilistic, death-driven ideology of the SS in its purest form, an ideology that would murder its own countrymen and helpless prisoners as if the entire Reich collapsed around them. Yet in the same moment, it revealed an equally powerful capacity for courage, decency, and cross-cultural solidarity. The defense of the castle was not just about saving a group of French politicians. It was a testament to the idea that a shared humanity can, under the right circumstances, overcome even the most deeply ingrained hatreds. It proved that the line between friend and foe is not always drawn by the color of a uniform, but by the content of one's character. In that single fact lies the enduring lesson of the battle for Castle Itter, that even in the darkest hours of the 20th century, a handful of good men could choose to stand together against the dying light of a monstrous evil, and, against all odds, win.